Bonjour tout le monde, et un joyeux Mardi Gras. Well, okay, it's not actually Mardi Gras at the time that I'm recording this. However, I do plan to release it on YouTube on Mardi Gras. So there you go. I couldn't really think of anything appropriately Carnival themed at the moment. It's kind of a weird time with Triangle Strategy coming out next Friday and other things going on. But I thought I'd take a little break from my drunken debaucheries to do something very nerdy and not in the spirit of the season, which is, in this case, something that will tie in my comments from my earlier video about Fire Emblem Three Houses and Triangle Strategy, namely that they are two strategy games with superficially similar premises that go in very different directions. And as I noted in that video, the main difference is that Fire Emblem, as always, is very character-driven, whereas Triangle Strategy does not look like it's going that way. So I felt like, what would be a good way to sort of tie those ideas together in something light and fun and not at all likely to cause controversy, because this game just causes discourse wherever you go. So I'm taking a bat at the proverbial hornet's nest here, possibly. But maybe that circles back around to being in the spirit of Carnival, vacuous hedonism and just feckless pleasure and all that sort of thing. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about all of the playable cast of Three Houses and sorting them according to the three convictions of Triangle Strategy, which you see at the top here: morality, liberty, and utility. I feel that all of them are fairly self-explanatory, although as I go in through sorting these characters, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how each of them comes up in terms of Triangle Strategy, and therefore how I think each character fits into them. And I think this would be a fun little exercise for my subscribers, or if you're new to the channel, maybe you just saw me talking about Triangle Strategy or Fire Emblem, and you want to hear me rant a little bit about these characters for a bit. And I also had the idle thought that it's not quite purple, green, and gold, the green, red, yellow of Triangle Strategy, but purple, green, and gold are the colors of New Orleans Carnival, and this is kind of close. So there's my very, very tenuous hook there. Anyway, so we do also have a fourth category down here, cannot be sorted, and I'm just going to go ahead and get that one out of the way really quick. If you've been following me on my blog for a while, or if you've listened to any of my Fire Emblem videos, you know exactly who's going here, and they're right at the start. So yeah, Byleth goes here. That is because Byleth is not so much a character as a self-insert. Their conviction is whatever the player wants it to be. Or at least it would be if Three Houses story splits were at all to do with morality or philosophy or anything like that, whereas they're really not. They're more like, which set of students are you horniest for? And then later on, does Edelgard make you horny? That's basically how Three Houses decides its story splits. I'm being, of course, facetious there, but, I think we all kind of know that the whole dating sim heroes wailing aspect of the Fire Emblem franchise by now. So it should come as no surprise that I'm just going to not bother with Byleth as a character, because they really aren't. However, right from the start, though, after them, things get very interesting, because we get to talk about the house leaders, of course, who are going to be, of course, the most controversial, although I do think they divvy themselves up quite nicely here, according to the Triangle Strategy mode. Edelgard is very much liberty. There's definite precedent for that, both within her own personality and within Triangle Strategy itself. Within Triangle Strategy, there is a Red Emperor who runs a meritocracy, and it is aligned with the concept of liberty. That anybody can get ahead if they're willing to put in the effort, and so nobody's restricted by things like gender or class or that sort of thing, which is ostensibly the sort of thing that Edelgard wants to build. Now, Crimson Flower doesn't really do a good job of showing that, but it also shows kind of what I think of as the dark, not necessarily darker, but more immature side of liberty, which is selfishness. The whole, she just declared a war, but she wants to go hole herself up in her room and eat sweets. that a lot of her bent is very anti-authoritarian, except if it's me. So that fits Edelgard very well, in addition to the meritocracy that she may or may not actually implement. And again, Gustadolf from Triangle Strategy does seem to already have a lot of things in common with Edelgard and other Red Emperors of the Fire Emblem franchise, so there's that very easy hook there. Dimitri is the easiest of the house leaders to pin. He is morality, definitely. Basically, and actually, when I first brought up this idea for a video, I had someone tell me, well, why just stick to 3 houses? Why don't you do like all the Fire Emblem Lords? And my response was, most of the Fire Emblem Lords are going to be in morality up here, because that is very standard for the series, the kind of story that they go through, that they're bound by things like duty, restoring a throne. It's worth noting that the character aligned with morality in Triangle Strategy, Roland, is very much a typical Fire Emblem Lord in terms of what we see of his narrative so far. His country gets invaded, he has to take it back. That is a classic Fire Emblem Lord setup, and Dimitri is the most traditional of the 3 house leaders as lords. So it's no surprise that he's here, that, duty and, doing the right thing for his people is forefront of his arc, and you can also read this as, his arc of needing to overcome his quest for vengeance. It also ties into morality, because vengeance is very contrary to having a strict moral code like that. So it works both ways, kind of like the Edelgard thing. And Claude, finishing off the trio, is utility. Utility is the biggest picture of the 3 convictions. And Claude, I think, has the largest ambitions of them. Dimitri wants to clean up his own house. Edelgard wants to make Adrestia great again, which means ruling the continent. But Claude wants diplomatic and cultural change to come to an entire landmass, and possibly beyond that, if you go by his ending tapestry. So he's definitely thinking the biggest, and that also ties into how he hides information and kind of manipulates his allies, not in an actively malicious way, but in a, this is for the greater good way. That is a very utility trait from what we've seen. It's pragmatic, and it is, again, looking way beyond what's going on currently. I think he's the hardest one to pin into one of these 3, because his arc does eventually come around to realizing that he had some things wrong with Rhea and the church, and that he gets little things like his serial support where he doesn't really understand what's going on with Elmira quite as much as he thought he did. But I still think he is predominantly utility focused. Okay, though. Now, this is not to say that each of the 3 houses divides up accordingly. And so to kind of emphasize that, I've next sorted the 3 sets of retainer and what I call contrarian number 3s, the trios at the top of each house. So we'll cover each of those together, because I do think it's kind of interesting how they all break down, like, separately. Like, for example, the Eagles, I think, have a good triad thing going on with Hubert is very clearly utility. He keeps the evil trains running on time in the Empire. Whereas Ferdinand is morality focused, because his idea is on, status and what the Prime Minister should do. Like in Crimson Flower, where he debatably gives up his morality, he retreats into that, what a Prime Minister should do for the Empire. And, of course, when he's going against Edelgard, he's making that decision because it is the right thing to do. So he is morality-focused, whereas the most evil man in Fodlan is, of course, looking at the very big picture, even beyond what Edelgard is looking at. And he's just... So I'd say they balance each other out, but I've written about this in my blog, that unlike the other 2 trios, the Eagles trio pivots around Hubert and not around its house leader, which is kind of weird. Like, when you get down to it, Edelgard and Ferdinand have very little interaction outside their supports, and Ferdinand is just part of the background chorus in Crimson Flower. He's actually more prominent in Silver Snow. So it's sort of balanced, but it doesn't quite work out. I mean, I have my headcanons for how it does, but that's way beyond the scope of this. If you've read my blog, you know what I'm talking about. Um, the Lions trio. This is the one that I think is not balanced, because Felix is definitely Liberty. Felix is very he is the angry, rebellious teenager aspect of Liberty. The screw authority, all your systems are messed up. That approach to Liberty, which is where he wants to go and do his own thing. And I mean, a big part of his arc in Azure Moon is realizing that, yeah, he was just kind of being an angry, rebellious teenager, and that he does have a role to play in his childhood friend's life, in that he kind of has to work through his complicated relationship with his father, and he can't just run away from it. And I think that's a big part of the reason why, if you take him out of Azure Moon, he gets a lot darker, or I guess he goes through negative character development, sometimes in similar ways to Dimitri. So, like, he's not as fully Liberty as he may initially look. And this is why, and here is why the Lions trio is not balanced, but I'm also showing a bit of shipper bias here. Dedue is definitely morality. Like, to balance things out, you would put him in utility, but I don't really see Dedue as utility focused. Dedue is, he has a similar sense of, duty and reparations for the genocide of his people, that sort of thing. And he holds Dimitri to them, as I've talked about in the Demi-Do videos. But he's also, he definitely wants revenge in the same vein that Dimitri does. You have that exploration phase right before the time skip where he has that really angry portrait that shows that he's actually just as enraged as Dimitri is. It doesn't come out as dramatically because he's not a main character. And as I said, this is a little bit of shipper bias, because arguably Dimitri and Dedue are the leader and retainer duo who are most consistently on the same wavelength. So it makes sense that they would be of the same conviction. That whereas Claude and Hilda kind of have this sort of joking, antagonistic back and forth, although it's never very serious, and Hubert goes behind Edelgard's back constantly, and you get that they're not really on the same level in terms of him being in love with her and her, pining after the teacher. But Dimitri and Dedue are very much, in sync with one another. The one time they're not is Crimson Flower, when Dedue does the thing with the crest stones, and Dimitri is, of course, horrified by that. And I just love that even then, as the player, you can choose to, circumvent that and give them a much more intimate and, dare I say it, gayer death scene to kind of get around that and still put them back on the same wavelength as they die. And going to the Deer trio, who are also balanced. Lawrence is morality in the same vein as Ferdinand. The story takes each of them to different places, but I think they're both very similar in that regard, including the fact that Lawrence's family defaults to the Empire, and that he just kind of has to deal with that as the story goes on in every route, except Crimson Flower, of course. Whereas Hilda is Liberty. As I said, Liberty is the most selfish of the three, and that's pretty much Hilda to a T. That she's doesn't really want to do much seriously, and I know part of that is like her facade so she can get out of doing work and all that sort of thing, but you also get the sense that she's just not as politically interested as a lot of these other characters are. And I think putting Hilda and Liberty illustrates an interesting point I have about that I kind of wonder if it will come up in Triangle Strategy, namely that of these three convictions, Liberty is the one where members of that same alignment are least likely to agree with or get along with each other, by the very nature of Liberty being extremely individualistic. Like, Hilda will never join up with Edelgard, and Felix basically becomes the same bloodthirsty killer that he hated in Dimitri if he joins up with Edelgard. Like, they're not compatible with one another, despite the fact that they're holding similar values. It could be the whole, I need to value myself, but then what is that? But then that comes into conflict when you have someone else who wants to value themselves. So that's why I think Liberty doesn't play well together. Okay, then. We're done with the retainers and the contrarian number threes. So next up would be the rest of the students, and I'll go through these hopefully a little more quickly, in most cases because they don't have as much to, to go with. Linhard, I think, is another one of those examples of liberty being fundamentally self-centered, and his supports with Edelgard illustrate that point that I was just making, namely that two people of liberty-aligned convictions, or however you want to phrase it, they're not likely to get along that well because their whole support line is Edelgard pushing Linhard to be more useful in a sort of utilitarian way, and Linhard doesn't like that. So that's, I mean, they eventually come to some kind of understanding, but people have sort of noted that that's not like, it's very, it says a lot about both characters. Let's put that support that way. Caspar is not the most complex character. I want to put him in morality because he does definitely seem to pivot around like ideas of what's right and wrong. I mean, his big thing about joining up with Edelgard is that he doesn't want to fight his family. But like Ferdinand outside of Crimson Flower, he does realize that fighting the Empire is the right thing to do, even if he still has reservations about it. So he's not the sharpest knife in the door, but I do think he's morality in a more simplistic way. Bernadetta is so much liberty it hurts. She is the epitome of, I don't care about anyone or anything else, just leave me alone in my room. That is her entire character, basically. So she is the epitome of selfish liberty, I think. Dorothea, I thought about for a while when I was going through the list of these characters, because you could also put her in liberty for, wanting to advance herself by whatever means necessary. But then I thought, by the whatever means necessary part, and also the fact that she's implied to be a sex worker. And I know if you haven't followed my blog and you don't know this about me, but let's just say that's something I find rather relatable about her. And I think that sex work is inherently a utility-aligned profession because it's sort of one of the highest examples of pragmatism, that you can commodify anything up to and including your body. And so I think that Dorothea being willing and knowing that she may have to use those channels in order to get ahead, I think that puts her in utility. Like, it's not, and by the way, I'm not saying any of that as a negative. I know Dorothea's sexual history is controversial, and like if you go with the very strong implications that she's not a virgin and that she did things like that in her past, some people yell at you for that. But as I said, I find that very relatable and familiar to me, just saying. So I'm not condemning her character for that. I actually like that. I think it makes her more interesting. Anyway, Petra, pretty easy morality. She's very much concerned with her duty to the people of Brigid. I kind of feel like if she'd been, say, more utility focused, they would have gone for that angle more in her Crimson Flower version, whereas the Petra in Crimson Flower we got is kind of more like a Stockholm Syndrome thing, which makes people uncomfortable, I know, but that's what we got. Ash, also fairly simple morality. He admires knightly codes of honor and that sort of thing, so, that's what he aspires to be, so of course he's morality. Sylvain, I think in the same vein, of Felix, goes under liberty, whereas his, big character conflict is that he wants to break out of the role society has set for him, sort of. I mean, he's a pretty weak example, since the role society has set for him is just get a trophy wife and then have lots of sex, and I guess that's bad. It's not well handled. I do like Sylvain as a sort of hedonistic nihilist. I would say that is very much in the spirit of New Orleans Carnival, going back to the start of this video. But I don't think that plays too much into the conviction system, yeah, hedonism, as it were. Well, or if it does, it is very definitely liberty, because it is very much about individual pleasure. Mercedes. She has a massive blind spot where her serial killer brother is concerned, but aside from that, she's pretty solidly morality. Up to and including the fact that if you stick her in the conquering villain route, she's very unhappy about it, except, of course, when she's dealing with the aforementioned brother. Annette's hard, because her main character hook is daddy issues, and that's not really easy to characterize, according to this metric anyway. I want to say liberty, because I feel like, as we'll talk about when we get to Gilbert, Gilbert is much more morality aligned. His whole, I failed my king, so I have to go into exile and leave my family, that sort of thing. So the fact that she's pushing against that, and also like making a name for herself in her studies and that sort of thing on the side, I think that puts her kind of like in a soft liberty category. Ditto Ingrid, and I'm just now noticing that I'm putting all three of the Fargus childhood friends in liberty. Ingrid also has the wanting to break away from societal expectations, although in her case it's, a lot more dour than what Sylvain is going through, namely that she doesn't want to be sold off. In marriage, she wants to be a knight. She basically has the same motivation as Ash, which is something they bond over in their supports. But Ingrid makes it more about herself and what she wants out of life than the morality and the ethics of being a knight, I believe. So that's why I put her in liberty. Okay, so moving on to the deer. Raphael is very similar to Caspar in a lot of respects, both gameplay-wise and character-wise, so no surprise, he goes into morality. I think he's even more clearly morality than Caspar is, because the guy doesn't have many character traits that are not eating and training, and so the very little that he has is wanting to protect his family, that's the whole reason he's at the monastery, is that he took his remaining savings and he wants to become a knight. So that is very morality focused and wanting to, uphold his duty as a brother / I think grandson. I think his grandfather's still alive. Yeah. Ignatz. Oh, Ignatz also has the I don't want to be like you, dad kind of thing that Felix has going on. With his artist aspirations, which inclines me to put him in liberty. I can't really see him as morality focused, even if he has a lot of opinions on religion and religious art. Some of them erotic in nature, which I find hilarious. He's definitely liberty. I'm thinking of some of the ways that he spins things like the conquest of Deirdre in Crimson Flower, and I'm like, you are making everything about your art, aren't you, sir? Lysithea. Lysithea is... I'm gonna say utility, and let me say why. Lysithea is on a timer, and she knows it. So her whole character is about getting as much knowledge as she can, and making some kind of useful contribution before she dies. You could say morality, since part of her hook is wanting to redeem her parents after what happened to her whole family. But I would say that overall she is very much focused on practical results of her research in whatever time she has left, and so that's why I feel comfortable putting her in utility. Liberty, I'd say Marianne. I'm thinking ahead. Marianne goes in liberty. This one took a while for me to think about. That's so when I came to the conclusion that Marianne was more liberty focused, it just, that's why I reversed them. But it is sort of the whole thing with the Fargus childhood friends. It's like breaking away from the path that the world has set out for her, and in her case, proving that she's not a monster and that she's her own self. She does have, I mean, she has a lot of the same religious devotions that Mercedes does, minus the Yuritsa thing, but hers are a lot more personalized, and so I can see that as not conflicting with the liberty aspect of it. Leonie. I remember Leonie has an exploration comment early in the game where she's like, she doesn't just want to make money as a mercenary, she wants to help people, so that is very morality focused. I feel like it's kind of contrary to the spirit of what being a mercenary is, but that's not entirely uncommon for fiction to, you know, kind of violate that. I mean, mercenaries by default would be utility aligned, like if they actually ran off of money like they're supposed to, or if they were actually motivated by money like they're supposed to. But it doesn't quite sound like that's her main goal here, even if she is more penny pinching than a lot of penny pinching, excuse me, than a lot of other characters, a lot of other characters. Yeah. Okay, so that's all the regular student characters. Now we are moving on to the remainder, the church characters, and then, of course, DLC. Let's run through these a little bit quickly, because I noticed that this video is already getting fairly long for what it is. Sedif Morality, pretty basic. I would kind of say he's got morality with utility leanings because of everything he's doing, you know, he's looking much further ahead, which is part of just being so long-lived, but he's looking ahead to protect himself and mostly his daughter. But I do think he's overall motivated by, like, actually trying to do the right thing and upholding the precepts of the church in, you know, good ways. I tend to be more part of the pro-church side of the fandom, but I'm not, like, saying that in a oppressive, dictatorial way, just in case anybody is watching, and it should be fairly obvious what I've said about Edelgard, where I stand on that. Like I said, Three Houses is an extremely controversial game, so let's just leave it at that for now. Liberty. I did it again. Okay, Flame goes in Liberty. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. And I think that's, as I said, Liberty is the most immature of the three convictions. That makes sense that when she's arguably the most immature member of the playable cast overall. She's still childlike in a lot of ways, and she just wants to be able to, how do you do, fellow kids, as the meme goes, with humans. That is her main goal. She does have morality leanings like her father does, but I would say she's predominantly liberty. Okay, the teachers. Hanneman. Let's get him out of the way. Hanneman has liberty leanings because of the whole thing about abandoning his house to become a professor. But I will say that overall he's more utility focused in the sort of for science sense. I think he fits there more comfortably. Manuela. Oh, I want to talk about Manuela. Manuela is one of my favorite characters. And I don't get to, and unlike, say, Dimitri and Dedu, I haven't made a whole video about her. Like Dorothea, she's gone through a lot of the same life experiences, so I do think there's a lot of overlap there. The main difference is that Manuela is older, and she seems to have carved out more of a role for herself independent of her life in the opera, both on stage and backstage, if you will. And a lot of her character quirks, like that she's an alcoholic, that she's very messy, that she's really desperate to find a man, but she just can't get one. They're very liberty aligned in, like, the messy queen kind of way that makes her just so entertaining. I've said in a previous video, she's like a drag act waiting to happen, and that's part of why I love her so much. But yeah, Manuela she's matured into liberty, where she's found a place for herself that doesn't necessarily depend on finding a rich guy to settle down with, even if she might have preferred that. Wouldn't we all? Gilbert. Well, I already spoiled this one earlier when talking about Annette, but he's in Morality. No surprise there. I mean, I know fandom likes to characterize him as a deadbeat dad, but he is. I mean, if he is looking at the, I failed my liege, so I'm a failure at life. So he's very consumed by guilt and shame, which are definitely morality traits. And so from that angle, it makes perfect sense that he would be there. And I think that's also why he clashes with Dedue and their supports, because Dedue would never dream of abandoning his liege lord, partially for other reasons, I'm sure, but, who's to say that wasn't happening with Gilbert? I have headcanons about the homoeroticism of Fargus knighthood that I will not expand upon here, because I've probably already done that in a video before, I think. Anyway. Alois. Let's just go with morality in the same vein as Leone, that he just wants to do his duty and do right by Geralt after Geralt is killed, so that's his main motivations when it's not lame dad jokes. Not much more to say about him. The axes and brawling guys tend to be pretty basic, except you Dedue. You are complex, but for different reasons. Sorry, my biases are very obviously showing here. Catherine. I think Catherine's liberty. She also did what Hanneman does, where she abandons her house to sort of live on her own with the church, but she doesn't have a utility-based hook, as it were. Her hook is that she's in love with Rhea, which, you go girl. I don't really know how to do the gay-lesbian solidarity thing, but I'm trying. Forgive me. So I think that's pretty cut and dried, especially because her partner, Shamir, is very plainly utility. Of course, there are different alignments. Shamir is what Leone would be if she actually took the whole money aspect of being a mercenary seriously, so it's not surprising that she's down here. I mean, there are times when she has more liberty-esque leanings, that, she wants to stay with the friends she's made, and that sort of thing, but she is predominantly utility, I think. Cyril. I have no idea where to put Cyril. I think morality, because he does seem to have a developed sense of it. It's just not explored very much because he's such a relatively minor character, and the character he's most focused on is an NPC, and as you'll note, Rhea is not even on this list because she's not playable, and that's my rule. So he does live for something bigger than himself, so he's not liberty, but I don't see him as utility either, even if he is pragmatic, so I'm just going to put him in morality in a hazy sense. Yuritsa, aside from Bernadetta, probably doesn't get more liberty than Yuritsa. He's a serial killer who wants to kill people, and he explicitly does not care about Edelgard's war, he just likes that she gives him an excuse to kill people. Can't get more liberty than that, in a very dark way. Anna, kind of similar to Yuritsa, she's very strongly of a certain type, in which case it's utility. I mean, she doesn't have support, she doesn't really have a character that we haven't seen before in her other playable appearances. She's just a capitalist. Just, that is what she is, a fourth wall breaking interdimensional capitalist. So, utility. Finally, though, we come to the Ashen Wolves, who hopefully will be more interesting than the other DLC characters, or update characters. Yuritsa's not DLC. Yuri, I thought about Yuri for a while. Utility and morality are his two big ones. Utility because he spends Cindered Shadows doing the whole triple agent thing, which again, like I mentioned with Claude, he's very bigger picture focused. But he does also have a strong moral code and a sense of duty toward the people of Abyss. I kind of waffled back and forth, but then I remembered his exploration dialogue right in the Crimson Flower encampment where he says that he just wants to be on the winning side. And I'm like, yep, you're utility, buddy. And also thank you for kind of bursting the bubble that, you know, the player is the underdog in Crimson Flower. Like, the game does its damnedest to try to make it feel that way, but they're really not. The Empire has the upper hand in all 4 routes. It's just they kind of walk that back a little to give Crimson Flower more of a story, I guess. Balthus, if Felix and the other Fargus childhood friends, to a lesser extent, are the teenage expression of selfish liberty, I would say that Balthus is the young adult equivalent of the same, where he is just mostly motivated by drinking and pleasure and gambling and running away from his gambling debts. He is, and perving after Claude's mom, apparently, and other MILFs, and possibly Yuri. Again, I have headcanons. Balthus is, like, adult selfish liberty. Constance. Superficially, Constance has a lot in common with Ferdinand and Lawrence. Where's Lawrence? Over here. In terms of character motivations, however, her biggest one is the restoration of her house, of course. And she's willing to do all manner of things to achieve that, so I'm willing to put her in utility for that. That she is looking at the bigger picture and possibly having to do some unsavory things along the way. I don't really have anything to say about her second personality. I don't like it. I don't think it really factors into this conversation at all. It's like 95% comic relief, and the other 5% is a mildly interesting game mechanic. So, Constance is utility. Happy. Happy goes in Liberty to finish off this list. Happy is very... She's, again, not so different from Felix and Linhard and all them that are primarily concerned with themselves and being anti-authority. Again, kind of like Hilda. I guess you could read the authority banes into that. I'm not touching boons and banes in this post. That's a whole separate thing, and I don't think it plays into triangle strategy at all. So Happy is just very individualistic with her everything. I think that's why she and Balthus get along quite well, and they have that silly paired ending where they're just wandering the world summoning monsters and then killing them. So that's that, and I'm actually already at the end. That kind of came up on me faster than I thought. I mean, I know all these characters at the bottom are, a lot of them are duplicates, but there's some other NPCs in there, but I'm not dealing with NPCs. That's beyond the scope of what I'm covering here. So there you have it. There's the cast of 3 houses sorted according to the convictions of the upcoming Triangle strategy. It's worth noting that data miners have already found out that the characters of Triangle strategy are similarly sorted, all of them apparently, according to each one prefers one of the 3 convictions. So this is kind of similar to that, and it'll be interesting to go back and look at this after Triangle Strategy comes out and compare them to the characters in that game. You know, but this was just a fun little exercise. It's kind of like how when 3 Houses first came out 2.5 years ago or so, the big thing was to sort characters into Hogwarts houses, because that was just a very obvious comparison. But that's very much played out now, so here's something fresh and new-ish, and something that I'm guaranteed, if you're watching this, you probably disagree with at least one of these. So I invite you to tell me about those disagreements, or your agreements, or whatever you want to talk about in the comments. And of course, to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to hear me talk more about these 2 different game properties, and among others, in the future. I would love it if you subscribe to my channel, but if not, just leaving a like would be a good indication that this fun little exercise just before Mardi Gras was entertaining for you, and maybe gave you a little bit of fun, lighthearted pleasure in the spirit of the season. Au revoir.